So this week we're going to talk about water pollution. So let's take a look at a few slides. These are some students from IVCC back in the day collecting water samples. We have been for well over 20 years taking water samples primarily from the Little Vermilion River, which runs from the Mendota area south and into the Illinois River at LaSalle. And we have several locations along there that we test the water for water quality. So we have, it would be called a longitudinal study. We have long-term data on the changes in water quality on that river. So what is water pollution? Well, simply put, it's just the degradation of water quality. Now, what that means more broadly is that degradation could be biological, chemical, physical, or a combination of all of those. If you look at this picture here, you can see a river has flooded and it got into the sewage lagoons associated with this livestock operation. And you can see the physical degradation of the water in terms of the change in the color of the water. And you can also imagine that there's been biological and chemical degradation as that sewage gets into the water. So what kind of pollutants are we talking about? Well, there are a lot of different categories of pollutants. These are some of the big ones. One big one is nutrients. Now that might seem a little strange, but essentially what is happening if you add too many nutrients, and specifically we're usually talking about phosphorus and nitrogen, too many nutrients to the water can be a problem, in part because those nutrients can cause problems for people who consume the water. Blue baby syndrome is something that happens if a baby has too much nitrogen in their system. They can have trouble absorbing oxygen into their bloodstream, and that would make them turn blue, which is not good. But the other thing that can happen with nutrients is that they can lead to algal blooms, which means you get a lot of algae showing up in the water. And I think we have a picture of this. This shows nutrients in rivers of the world. And I think on the next slide, we'll actually get to see what that bloom looks like. So I'll just kind of skip ahead so you can see that. But this is an area affected by nutrient pollution. And we'll explain exactly what that leads to in a minute. Petroleum, oil spills, gas spills, all kinds of stuff like that can pollute the water. Very often this comes in small amounts from boats and cars. You think, well, how does it get from a car into the river? But essentially rain washes it off the pavement, and that's how it gets into the river. And then there's a huge variety of toxic substances, hazardous chemicals, heavy metals, radioactive material that can cause problems for human health and environmental health. And then we have sediment pollution when you have a disruption of the ground surface, and this could be from wildfires, it could be from agricultural activity, it could be from construction, and rain falls on that ground, it can wash a lot of extra sediment into a river or a stream. And this can cause a lot of problems. A really good example of that is Lake Peoria down by Peoria is very, I would say slowly, but really pretty quickly filling up with sediment and has to be dredged in order to maintain it for navigation. And then thermal pollution is when you change the temperature of the water, and this can go either way. So our power plants that we have in LaSalle County, specifically LaSalle Nuclear Power Plant, generates a lot of waste heat. Now to get rid of that waste heat, they circulate water through their system. If they were to put that water directly into the Illinois River, that could cause some serious ecological impacts. And so instead, they have these large ponds or lakes that they've built next to the power plant to allow that excess heat to escape. You can also have water that's colder than normal. So for example, if you have a large lake that you built with a dam, the water coming out of that lake downstream of the dam, depending on where you take it out of the lake, could be unusually cold. If you're taking water from the bottom of the lake, the temperature tends to be lower than it otherwise would be. And again, changing the temperature of the water in a river can cause problems for the ecosystem. So this just shows some selected chemicals. This is a table out of your book. Just gives you an idea of the tons per year that are being released into the water. And you'll notice fertilizer, inorganic nitrogen, phosphorus, those are actually some of the really big contaminants. Some of these things that they list, the number might look small, but the amount of a contaminant you get in your system is going to vary depending on the contaminant and how you got it, but its impacts will also vary depending on how well your body deals with that particular contaminant. And the same thing goes for the ecosystem. So quantity is not necessarily an indicator of how dramatic the impact will be. Generally speaking, more is worse, but in the case of some contaminants, even a small amount can be pretty bad. So, one of the results of pollution and one of the measurements that we make is something called biochemical oxygen demand. And this is related, as I mentioned earlier, to excess nutrients in the water. What the measure is milligrams per liter of oxygen consumed over 5 days at 20 degrees centigrade. And what it indicates is how friendly of an environment that water is to certain types of algae. Now, at first you might think, well, those algae, that'd be a good thing, right? Because they are producing oxygen, and this is all about oxygen consumption. But it gets more complicated than that, because if you add extra nutrients to the water, the algae bloom that you get, number one, might produce some excess oxygen, but at night those algae need to consume oxygen to live through to the next day. And then when they die, the decomposers that consume them are things that do not produce oxygen, and they can use up a lot of oxygen. So basically, when you create an algal bloom, you might initially get a bump up of oxygen produced, but when those algae die, you're going to get a significant drop in the oxygen available in the water. And that can cause problems for everything else that lives in the water. Usually, the pollutants that produce this are agricultural runoff, the fertilizer that runs off farm fields, and sewage, so the stuff that comes out of the sewage treatment plants. And there are ways to deal with both of those pollutants, but typically they are poorly controlled. And the end result is what we call a dead zone. In this case, the dead zone is down off the coast of Louisiana, down current from the Mississippi River. So the Mississippi River here on the right discharges a large quantity of nutrients into the Gulf of Mexico. That triggers a algae bloom. The algae die, the decomposers use up the oxygen, and you end up with a dead zone. Which means that if you're somebody who fishes for shrimp, for example, in this zone with low oxygen, there aren't going to be any shrimp. They're either dead or they swam away when they couldn't get enough oxygen. So, and this happens in rivers, lakes, and oceans all around the planet. This bloom off the Mississippi River is typically found in June, July, August, when there's a large amount of agricultural runoff coming down the Mississippi River. Another pollutant that we get concerned about are pathogenic organisms. This can trigger human disease. We usually associate this with sewage. Even treated sewage can have some of this. If it's properly treated, it shouldn't. What we measure in this case is something called fecal coliform bacteria. That is what would be considered an indicator species. As far as I know, fecal coliform bacteria do not make people sick, but when they're relatively easy to culture in a sample that you might collect, and their presence indicates the presence of waste material, and therefore other pathogenic organisms or dangerous organisms are probably located in that water as well. So they're basically, it's a measure of an indicator species, and if it's there, then you can assume that other bad things are there. So how does this all work? So as a geologist, what you have to do is look for three things, and this is somewhat discussed in your book, but this goes back to my original job when I got out of college. I did environmental work for an environmental consulting firm, and we had to find three things. We had to find a source of the pollutant. No source, then you don't have to worry about pollution. It then needs a route. It needs a way to get from wherever somebody put it or dropped it or dumped it to another location. So, and that route could be flowing over land when it rains. It could get into rivers. It could be going through the groundwater, and the wind could pick it up and blow it away. In addition, there's a route where people can actually go to the waste and touch it, which seems like a bad idea, but depending on how that waste is positioned on the landscape, that might make a little more sense for why that would happen. And then there has to be a target. So if you have a source and a route, but there's nothing affected by the pollution, then we would generally not consider it to be a problem. So the target could be people, and it could be the ecosystem or things that live in the environment. So those are possible targets. If you don't have all three of those, then you don't have a pollution problem. But typically, if there's a source, there's usually some kind of pathway for it to leave the site that we at least have to keep an eye on, and there are always potential targets in the environment. So let's talk about source a little bit more. We categorize sources as point and non-point sources. Point sources are the easy ones to understand. This is a point source. A pipe where you got whatever's in that water coming out into the environment. So that is what we call a point source. You can point to it and go, that's the specific source. A smokestack would be another example of a point source. Non-point sources are diffuse sources. And what that means is that they are putting pollution into the environment in small amounts over a large area. So, for example, the runoff from a parking lot. If you think about a parking lot where all the cars sitting there and many of them are leaking something, they might be leaking a little radiator fluid, coolant. They might be leaking a little bit of oil. They might be dropping a little bit of gas, like when somebody pumps it, but just small amounts. And that can end up on a parking lot. And then when it rains, all that material gets washed off the parking lot and into a nearby lake or stream. And so that's what we would call a non-point source. Another really good example of a non-point source would be something like an agricultural field. These are diffuse. There can even be non-point sources in a factory if you have little drips of things escaping from all kinds of machines. One machine with its little drip, probably not a problem, but when you add all of those together, then you can potentially have a problem. And so where we will pick up on the next set of slides is to discuss the state and finish off this slide and then move on from there.